What is this on, f4? Let's try 1.4. Hey guys, Omar here. I myself am a bit of an f4 snob. If I have a lens that's f2 or 1.2 or 1.4, I never think about f4. And there are times when we probably shouldn't be shooting at 1.2 and 1.4. Also, if you only have an f4 lens, what you're missing out on. Okay, let's change this to f4. f4. I'm so depressed now. Do you need a 1.4 lens? Well, it depends. I've been watching Hamilton a little bit. You know, there's rap in that. Now, first of all, you should know that using a wider lens like a 16mm 1.4 is different than using a zoom lens like the 56mm 1.2. If you're using anything that zooms or has a larger focal length, then getting a blurry background or bokeh is easier with those lenses. With a wider lens, it's harder to get blurry backgrounds. It all has to do with how close and how far. So we're going to look at some photographs and explore what's the point where 1.4 is useful, where is it not useful, how far away should you be? Let's discuss. Okay, so the images we're looking at today are from my trip to Maine. And this is a perfect example of where I saw this old rusty car and wanted to get a photograph of it. And if I wanted to get a blurry background, I probably should have put my 56mm lens on there at 1.2 and go completely across the street. So here it is at 1.4. And if you notice in the background here, we don't really have much bokeh back there. And so if I am 10 feet away from something, the 1.4 doesn't really show up so much. Now, if I get closer to the car, you start to see a little bit of that nice quality that people love in the 16mm 1.4. But still, it doesn't have the full 16mm 1.4 flavor that we love. For that, you gotta get really close. And that's here. And there you start to get that cool look of the 16mm 1.4, which is very sharp close up, and then just the background blows up into a blurriness. As soon as you step away a little bit, you start to lose that effect of the 1.4. However, with great power comes great responsibility. If you're shooting at 1.4, you should know what distances you can get away with before your picture is just a blobby, stupid mess. So, for example, the claw. Saw this little crab claw here and I shot it at 1.4, but look, it's that's where people email me and they're like, why are my photos all blurry? One of the reasons could be this. You're completely at 1.4 and you're too close. So the focus distance is very slim, basically none of the claw. And so if you stop down to f4, this is f4. And now it makes sense. So sometimes you kind of have to know how much depth you need in your photograph. You focusing on me? Overhead shots. Overhead shots, forget 1.4, forget 1.1, 1.0. Any kind of food overhead or anything that's flat on a table, go right to f4, 5.6. These are the sharpest parts of your lenses. If you zoom into these eggs, look at this, look at this. Amazing little fibers, you could see everything because we shot it at f4. Eggs, 1.4 and 4. Well, here it depends what you're going for. If you're going for very dreamy and very breakfasty morning delicious bokehness, then you have to shoot it at 1.4. It also, viewing distance is important too. If you're looking at this on a website or a cell phone, the 1.4 completely works fine. If you're looking at it at a larger print, most of it will look blurry. Like there is no exact subject that's clear here. At f4, the eggs look a little bit more inviting. In this one, maybe the truth lies between the two, like 2.8 or something like that. But again, the point is the number 1.4 and f4, they're just not arbitrary numbers that you punch in. It has to do with what you want as your final look. Now, sometimes you want to get rid of background distractions. For example, this one would have worked at f4 if there wasn't a bunch of junk in the back, like Skippy and the pepper. And so sometimes a photograph will lose a little bit of its, feeling and pop if there are too many distractions. So 1.4, even though it's not smart to use so close, here it makes sense to get rid of the background. Now 1.4 works great if you have a little bit of a foreground element because the foreground element will completely go blurry. Here with the seaweed, we have some rocks that are in the foreground element, and we also have great bokeh in the distance, and we're sort of focusing here on the seaweed. If you go to f4, then you see a little bit more of the background and a little bit more of the foreground. The image still works, but it doesn't have as much isolation as the 1.4 does. With great bokeh comes great responsibility. I got to minimum focus distance here at 1.4. I mean, the part of the shell is kind of in focus, but I shouldn't have shot it at 1.4. So I shot it at f4. And at f4, I got enough depth, maybe that much, where I was able to get the shell in focus. And look at the background. At f4, at this distance, there's enough bokeh to be happy. Now, full body portraits. This is why I like shooting full frame cameras with like a 50mm 1.4, because you get good separation in the background. I kind of love that look. With a 16mm at 1.4, I wanted to know what's the distance where the lens starts to make sense. And this is at 1.4, I might as well have taken it with a cell phone. Everything's kind of in focus. Use portrait mode on your cell phone. We then did 5 feet away, and at 5 feet away at 1.4, you start to get a little bit of separation with bokeh. 3 feet. Now at 3 feet, this is where we begin to shine. At 3 feet away from a subject, upper body, the 1.4 is magical, in my opinion. And if you go f4, you have a little bit of bokeh and it still works. I think for a couple of people or a group of people, f4. For one person at 3 feet, 1.4 looks amazing. The person's ears even are starting to get a little blurry here. And 2 feet, the story continues. I think that's where as close as you want to get because it starts to distort the person's face at 2 feet. Again, misuse of 1.4. So my son picked up the little crab claw and I wanted a cool shot of bokeh in the background, but this is just like too much bokeh, like relax. His nail is in focus, which is behind the claw, and the claw is somewhat in focus in different parts. And this is where f4 will work. The minimum focus distance on this lens is great. You can get objects that close to the camera. And look, you can kind of see him back there. He's blurry, you can see he's smiling. So in this case, f4 worked a lot better than 1.4. Here's another example of ridiculous 1.4 not needed. And if you stop down to f4, you get a little bit more of the story. We have the blueberries in the front that are nice and sharp, and you got bokeh in the background, but you could see people picking blueberries. f4 for the score. Hamilton. And the last example where we're turning it all the way around, where you want the 1.4. So this frog was super still, did not want to move. So I moved it to f4 to make sure that the frog was focused and got closer, took a shot, closer, took a shot, closer, took a shot. And then once I was super close and was okay with f4, I switched it to 1.4. And here I think it does work. I think shooting at 1.4 here is, you can't ever get this look with any other lens unless you did it in post. So the moral of the story is you don't want to shoot at f4. You always want to shoot at 1.4.